Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Z, and welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, we are going to be talking about affairs, specifically why those with narcissistic personality disorder have affairs, because their reasons on the surface may appear very similar, but underneath, their motives are completely different than what you may think. And so today, I have with me Lauren LaRusso, who is an expert in working with people who have been involved in relationships where one partner has gone outside of the marriage. And I love her work because she has such a objective, non-judgmental, but really just accurate description of why these really complicated relationships occur. With really good resources, and she just does amazing work. So, a little bit about Lauren LaRusso. She is a psychotherapist and founder of the Affair Consultant. She has helped countless of individuals and couples process the unexpected and inalterable impact of infidelity on their lives. She uses infidelity as a catalyst to personal insight and growth and works with clients around the world. Lauren is currently writing a book to help betrayed spouses thrive after infidelity, to be published later next year in January. By Penguin Random House, and you can actually order the book or pre-order the book now, which I will include in my show notes in the links. She publishes an advice column 3 times a week on Substack and also developed courses to help guide all parties in an affair: the unfaithful spouse, the affair partner, and the betrayed. This is a really difficult topic to talk about for a whole bunch of reasons, but it is really informative. And I think you're going to get a lot of information and a lot of questions answered in this episode. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Z. Welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, we have one of my favorite guests, and we've been trying to do this for a year. But I'm going to hand this over to you. Introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and then we're just going to jump into it because I have so many questions from listeners.
That's great. Thanks for having me. I'm super happy to be here. My name's Lauren LaRusso. I'm a psychotherapist, and I specialize in helping people use the experience of extramarital affairs to transform their life for the better. I use the experience of infidelity as a portal for self-understanding and personal growth. And I work with all parties who are affected by and involved in an affair or affected by or involved in infidelity. So it's not just one side, it's all sides. And I think that comprehensive view is a really important part of the healing process for everybody.
Yeah, love that description. Very well said. So I'm going to start with what do you classify as an affair? We're going to set narcissistic personality disorder aside for a second. But in your experience, what would you or how would you categorize an affair?
An affair can be emotional or physical or a combined type affair. Sometimes it starts as one or the other and then becomes a combined type affair. But essentially, an affair is a deeper, more longitudinal relationship outside of the primary monogamous relationship that's not known to the primary monogamous relationship. It's a betrayal of the agreement that existed between the primary committed partners to not share those parts of themselves outside of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it is shared outside of the relationship. So it's that betrayal. And there's a connection and a chemistry and a secrecy to it that defines it as different than just a friendship or a co-working relationship or something platonic. It's a different form.
And in your experience, what would you say are I'm going to talk about men and women separately, but let's start with women. What would you say are the primary reasons why females, and I know this is a very generalized statement, but just generally speaking, what would you say the reasons are that women would engage in an affair outside the marriage? And I love the way you say it. It's a betrayal of the agreement. I've actually never heard somebody describe it like that. And I like that because it almost sets the people aside in that, and you're talking about the agreement, which is interesting. So what would you say are the reasons why a female would be more likely to go outside of the marriage in her partnership?
Yeah, and I want to build on what you said in terms of just being cautious about overgeneralizing, just
Mm-hmm.
because truly one thing about affairs that's so important to the work is that each situation, while there could be themes that we find in this work, is so unique, and that
Yes.
anything I say in here on my social media, you need to genuinely compare it against your own
Yes.
experience. Do not take what I'm saying as the gospel ever, because we are the keepers of our own truth. And that's so important. So I just want to say that when it comes to women, usually the emotional connection is more of the driver. It starts with that emotional um, interest, that disclosure. And it's more often to start in like a friendship that evolves into something more. Um, that being said, there are plenty of women who are motivated, by sexual chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, I would say that women who feel very alone in their marriage are much more vulnerable to infidelity.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that it's to kind of find something that's missing, or they need more of something that's already there? And I know situations are all unique, but the way you're describing it sounds like it's more to fill a void of something that they're not getting.
Yeah, I think life is hard and long, and a marriage is hard and long, and there's going to be many times, whether it's chronic or episodic or a season of life, where you feel unmet by your partner, unfulfilled in that relationship. Maybe you're like ships passing, or you're in a roommate phase, or it's always kind of been that way. Whatever the circumstances are, we're built for connection, and we
Mm-hmm.
we give meaning to our lives based on the quality of our connections. And so if the connection at home is not strong, that does leave a void. And so whether it's that they're looking for something, or that they've just accepted that, I'm not going to get all my needs met here at home. I love my spouse, we're great business partners, co-parents, all these things. Maybe I even really like my spouse, maybe I love my spouse, but no one person can fill all needs all the time. There's going to be lapses we all bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a difficulty feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling supported, feeling met, and especially we know women tend to really be like the caretakers of the family, the emotional laborers, the keepers of the family unit. That can feel like, okay, I've just like totally faded into this space. And so sometimes it's really an experience to see themselves anew when they've gotten lost in that phase of life. So, I think it does ultimately end up filling a void, whether or not someone is actually looking to fill that void. I
Mm-hmm.
would say more often than not, they're perhaps surprised
Mm-hmm.
at themselves to find themselves in that position rather
Mm-hmm.
than seeking it. But
Interesting.
certainly sometimes people are seeking it.
And let's switch over to men. What would you say are there differences in why men and women go outside the primary relationship?
Yeah. I mean, attraction is huge. Sex is huge. By and large, an affair, I hate to be general, but um, is less likely to threaten a man's marriage if he feels like he's just getting his sexual needs met elsewhere, when it becomes a combined type affair for a man. It's much more destabilizing to the marriage, because men tend to, and again, I really hate generalizing, but I'm just
Mm-hmm.
doing it here for the sake of some kind of clarity. They tend to keep their emotional selves for their spouse. And so once that begins to transition outside of the marriage, something big has changed in terms of, that emotional bandwidth, which was already perhaps a little bit less deep and vast than a woman's would be just by nature of culture and society and how we're raised.
Interesting.
That smaller well now is going somewhere else. And so it's much more threatening to the relationship. But
Interesting.
I mean, attention is also huge, right? Feeling seen, getting
Mm-hmm.
that attention. Sometimes that's really all it takes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine too that in those situations, because the attention that we'll say in this case the man is getting outside of the relationship is so focused on one person, that it appears that they're getting all this attention because the nature of the affair allows for that to happen. You're each other's kind of primary focus in a sense. So it's confusing because it appears that you're getting all this attention, but in reality, it's the affair itself that's constructing this illusion for you, because you have to keep that going or else the affair crumbles. So it's interesting that it gives you all these things, but it's not so much and I'm not saying the person doesn't do this, but it's more of the context and the situation that allows for these things to happen because of the nature of what it is to begin with.
It's like an incubator.
Yes.
And I think it's great you brought that up, because you're right. And then there becomes often a mounting case built against the marriage and the spouse. Like, well, you don't do this. You don't listen to me this way. You don't. And that all may be founded in some level of truth. And at the same time, there's not 3 kids pulling at your pants when you're trying to
no
finish
mortgage payments, right? There's no carpools.
You're not bringing home your most exhausted, worst self,
yes.
which goes both ways. So the person having the affair oftentimes is mounting a case against their spouse at home. That spouse at home may be feeling exactly the same way. Like, I wish you would step up. I'm drowning here. But they don't have that relationship outside of the marriage in which to have that stronger comparison. And it becomes a very slippery slope.
So let me ask a question. I know it's going to sound bizarre to listeners, but I think it's an important one. Do you ever find that people who go, and again, for those listening, I'm not saying this is right, but I'm just genuinely curious. Do you find that people who go outside of the marriage, who have no desire to leave their primary partner, but in a way kind of use this affair outside of their marriage so that they can maintain or stay in their marriage in a way? Does it ever help the marriage? And I know it's based on a lie, and I know it's based on betrayal. I understand that. I'm curious though, in their mindset, do they feel that it's making their marriage stronger because some need is being met, so there's no argument about that need?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. So, okay. So the question is, does the affair ever improve or stabilize the marriage? And the answer is yes. Yes.
Talk to us about that a little.
Yeah. Again, it's layered and it depends. But in a marriage that's good enough, I'm going to put that in quotes, the good enough marriage, because no marriage is perfect and every marriage is going to have voids and gaps and the humdrum of everyday life. In a marriage that is as good as it really gets, there's always going to be that void. And so the affair comes and steps into that void and is like this bright light in someone's life. It just adds color and texture and connection and excitement and all of the things that really aren't found at home. And it can be deeply fulfilling, and it can actually help someone stay in their marriage. And so what I find when I'm working, especially with affair couples, is that part of the paradox is that, let's say you are married and you've fallen in love with someone outside of your marriage, as happens often with an affair. And you suddenly begin to find yourself wondering if you should leave your marriage because of this affair, which is not usually how it begins. I mean, it does sometimes, but again, sometimes not. Sometimes someone's just looking to fulfill a part of themselves, or they're feeling vulnerable or whatever. They're not looking to destabilize their life. They're not looking to, nuke their core family. But then over time, this is the risk you take when you form a relationship outside of your marriage, is that you may have a shift in a change in heart, and you may begin also to get pressure to leave. That's sometimes where affairs
pressure
end.
From the other person.
Yeah. Yep. And sometimes that's where an affair, ends. It doesn't have a life beyond that. But, part of the problem and the paradox becomes that leaving your marriage while you are actively having an affair is actually a lot more difficult because the pain isn't there. When you're in a lonely marriage, when you're in a marriage where you can point to the voids And you can say, you know what, we're great in these areas. And I also feel really unmet, unseen, unfulfilled on whatever in all these other areas. You're feeling the tension and you're able to identify it really, really clearly for yourself. When the affair steps in and begins to light up those other areas, it creates a very distorted experience that you can't really trust anymore. And it really reduces the pressure around those areas of unhappiness. And so someone who's married in an affair, they really ultimately may struggle more to make a change because it is actually keeping their life much more stable to have.
Interesting. Both. And I would imagine without that, then they're forced to have to face what's in front of him.
Exactly right.
But whereas if not, then they can, if something's bothering them, they can go and, think about the other person, meet the other person. And so they don't really have to sit with that discomfort as much anymore.
Exactly. And now you have something to hide that you feel guilty about and anxious about. So you're not going to want to go to couples therapy because you're going to be put on the spot and you're going to have to lie. You're not going to start pushing back against your spouse. Some people do.
Yeah.
But, if you begin to be the one who brings up those issues and, as you say, sit in the discomfort of them, now you're putting yourself in a difficult position where you're shining.
You have to work on them.
Exactly. You're shining a light on the relationship issues and you don't actually want to deal with them because, it makes you lie even more. It makes you have to distort the truth even more. So it really screws up the dynamic of a primary relationship.
So I'm going to ask the question then that I get it with the populations that I work with. The infamous question of, then why don't you just leave? Right? Like, why cheat? If you're unhappy in your marriage, why are you cheating? Why don't you just leave? Just leave. Right. And so I'm sure you get these comments on your posts as well. In fact, I've seen these arguments in your posts. I'm sure you've seen them on mine. If they're that unhappy, just leave. If they're being abused, well, they just leave. Or in this case, if, they want to have an affair with somebody else outside the marriage, just leave first and then do it. So way easier said than done, obviously, for a whole host of reasons. And again, I'm not saying they're right, wrong. These are the issues, but why is it so difficult for somebody to just leave when I think it's two things. Why is it so difficult for somebody to just leave when they're unhappy even in a healthy marriage? Because you could be in a healthy marriage and still be unhappy. So, why don't people just leave and then start the affair? Why don't they just leave once they feel they met somebody? Why stay?
Yeah. These are great questions. And I would love to hear your thoughts too. Obviously, there are some situations where, like you really should have gone towards your marriage harder, at least first.
Because that's what people say. People just get divorced. They don't even try. And I always hated that line because that's not true. I mean, I don't know many people that just wake up one day and say, oh, you know what? I'm done. I don't feel like doing this anymore. If it's not an outward try, it sure as hell is an inward struggle, constantly trying. So I think that's a piece. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to bring that up too, because I think there's this massive judgment that's placed on people, that nobody works on their relationships anymore. Well, yeah, no. I mean, if you look at like our grandparents, and my grandparents were married for God knows how long. Were they happy? No, they hated each other. And you look at these people that are married for 60 years, just because you're married 60, 70 years doesn't mean it was a happy marriage. Yeah. So back to you again.
Longevity.
Yeah. So why do people stay? What if they are planning to leave or planning to go outside the marriage? Why not just leave?
Well, I think that comes full circle to the idea that oftentimes people aren't planning to go outside of the marriage. They're sitting in that unhappiness. They're sitting in that discomfort. And oftentimes they're sitting in avoidance. I mean, I know a lot of people do work on their marriage and a lot of people also don't. They don't want to do the work. And frankly, there's a lot of people who don't want to go to therapy, who don't want to read the books, they just want to live their life. And that's their right. And, we're therapists. So we're always coming from that lens of like, what could be done here? Let's construct something out of nothing. But I have to put myself in the seat of other people who are just really doing the best they can with where they are at that time in their
Yes.
life. And they're not, looking to become a therapist in training through self-help books. So that being said, I think that an affair, it is an avoidance tactic often. It does, to your point, help sometimes fill those voids without needing to destabilize the life. Is it right? Of course not. But, we're all trying to move away from pain in our lives and make our lives more sustainable and comfortable. And so sometimes it is someone who wants to keep everything intact, but also doesn't feel like they died a million deaths
Yeah.
before, their kids went for college or,
Yeah.
whatever that milestone is where they could reevaluate that. And the truth is not everyone feels they can leave and not everyone can leave.
That's true.
I mean,
Correct.
honestly, sometimes leaving is not the best thing for the
Correct.
kids, for people's lives. It's very nuanced, and we have to
Mm-hmm.
be really careful
Mm-hmm.
about these blanket statements that we use because leaving is hard,
Yep.
hard,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's
And
not for everybody.
no, and I think too that I think people will say, well, you have a kid and you have this and you have, you have all this beautiful life and which leads to more shame and guilt, I think, on the person. And I agree with you. It's not that what their actions are right. And at the same time, it's so much more than someone just wanting to have sex with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
It really is so intertwined and intricate, and there's many reasons why. Is it a choice that they personally make that they need to take accountability for? Absolutely. Is the context with which they made that decision 100% their fault? No, what happened in the marriage, right? And they made that choice. Was that choice right? No. For them, it gave them something. It helped them stay. It gave them courage to leave. Who knows? But there's always more. I think what I'm getting at on this, there's more than just what we see on the surface, which is why I love your work and I send a ton of people your way because you look at it from such a non-judgmental, very kind of fact-based approach without the stigma attached to it. Because as you said, life is hard. Marriage is hard. These are not easy things. And so everybody does the best that they can. I want to go to the part about the leaving and why some people can't leave and all that. And that I want to tie that into narcissistic abuse and coercive control. So the types of affairs that we've been talking about currently are those that take place in not necessarily unhealthy, toxic marriages, just everyday, run of the mill, average marriages that aren't neither good or bad. Some could be very toxic, but I want to specifically talk about narcissistic abuse in intimate partnerships and coercive control and how affairs show up differently in those types of dynamics. So to start, we know that to try to leave a relationship where there is narcissistic abuse and coercive control is extremely difficult for many reasons. They can't just leave. They usually have no access to their finances, no social support. It's the highest risk for violence, particularly for females and children when they try to leave. It's the highest time for, like I said, physical violence, for assaulting the children. And it's not just over when the person leaves. The abuse, the post-separation abuse continues indefinitely. So there's a lot of reasons for that. That's why they can't just leave. What is unique in these types of narcissistic, abusive, and coercive controlling relationships is that when you're dealing with someone who has narcissistic person, let me put it this way. Not everybody who has an affair, who cheats, is a narcissist. Let me make that very clear. What I will also make clear is that the majority, I'm not going to say all, the majority of people with narcissistic personality disorder, particularly males, the majority of them do go outside the primary relationship. It is part of their supply chain. It is part of their orbit, their world they create. Everybody is an object. And so they have to constantly be surrounded by sources of supply. And an easy way to get supply, yes, is from your spouse and your children. That's why they get married and have kids. But when that runs dry, That is when they go outside of the marriage to have those affairs. But it's also about dominating, control, and power. And so let me just stick with men. Yes, women do this as well, but let me just stick with men for this. To go outside the marriage and to accumulate as an object as many sexual partners you can have, to be in a position of power and authority over another female. That's their underlying function. It's not because they're unhappy in their marriage. They do it because they're entitled to it. They do it because it gives them control and power. So on the surface, the behaviors may look the same, but the underlying function it's inherently different. And so that's why I wanted to first go through why people have affairs that are not narcissistic and what that looks like, versus the reason why people who are narcissistic have affairs. And it is very different. Again, I'm not saying the behaviors in either situation are correct, but I want to talk about the underlying reason. I would bet a lot of money from my experience and hearing stories and working with other professionals that someone with narcissistic personality disorder always has somebody in the wings. And it's usually the person they bring in when they break up with you. All of a sudden they're posting this new face on social media and you're like, where did this come from? But it's not just one. It's likely not just two. It's multiple people for the purpose of power and control. So in your work, when you've experienced people who are having affairs, if you even want to call them that in these situations, but going outside of the relationship and not really having intimate relationships with them, maybe faking it in the beginning for this purpose of getting supply, but having all of these people set up as objects they take off the shelf when they need supply, whenever that may be, whenever their current supply is not available. That's kind of the dynamic of affairs in narcissistic abuse. But I'm curious your take on that and what you've seen.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to add, you mentioned that oftentimes there's multiple partners, multiple affairs. Yes, sometimes, but also sometimes not, because oftentimes with narcissistic partners who are unfaithful, they are the pinnacles in the community. They are the celebrated professionals.
Mm-hmm.
They're the high-powered attorneys, the beloved doctors, the community organizers, the person in the church. That's the place where they are getting their sense of worth and those needs met, that supply met, can come from so many other places.
Mm-hmm.
And we often see, like, the minute that a spouse is not fawning over you,
mm-hmm.
or a baby enters the picture, or, there's a life challenge, they don't lean into the relationship.
Right.
They lean right out of it because they feel so victimized that they should not be on the pedestal anymore, or that, they're not getting all of their needs met and being praised endlessly at home or whatever. And they feel deep sense of victimhood around life at home, even if that spouse is doing 95%.
That's right. The resentment of that child and the mom for having that baby and, in a sense, knocking them off the pedestal when, a healthy-minded person would know that they, their child comes first. What I find with what you're talking about, the professionals, these kind of members of community that everybody knows and admires and thinks they're amazing and wonderful. And then 10 years later, we see them on the news for doing God knows what. But those types of people, I find, they're the ones who have, I want to say more sneaky, the business trips, the prostitution in that realm.
There's a full double existence.
It's
indefinitely.
Yes.
And that's go on indefinitely.
Exactly. And that's what I see a lot of in that capacity, that it's more of almost a secret life, so to speak, that they're able to compartmentalize, and they do a really good job of it. But if they're found out, why'd you go through my phone? There's no accountability. Well, you don't have sex with me, so what do you expect me to do?
Yeah, I don't have sex with you because you're a mean person.
Correct.
Trust, right?
Correct.
Round and round we go.
Exactly. So the other person is made to feel it's their fault, where I think in other types of relationships where coercive control doesn't exist, you're more likely to get a genuine apology and genuine shame and genuine, hurt that you've caused hurt. Whereas with a narcissist, when they get caught, it's neither here nor there for
self-righteous
them. Yeah.
indignation.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
very, very different flavor.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to drive home too, because I don't want anyone who's listening ever to think that being in a relationship with someone who has a narcissistic, antagonistic personality type, that's like not what's happening to them, because it's not this extreme,
Correct.
and I
I just
think
had this conversation with somebody.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
like, it doesn't always take on that extreme shade.
Yes.
And recognizing what you're dealing with and who you're dealing with is a huge, important part of the healing process
Hmm.
for someone who's been in a relationship with someone who uses these kind of antagonistic tactics
Yes.
to manipulate, to gaslight, to feel entitled, to empathize only for the sake of getting their needs met, to distort. There's a deep well of psychological damage that goes on, and it doesn't need to look all one way. And it
Nope.
can take a long time to figure out, oh my God, this is
Yep.
what I was dealing with.
Yes. I
Holy,
see this all the time.
yes.
I see this. That is more the norm
Yes,
of
it is
of
more
the
the norm.
patients that I see, that they knew it's either they were constantly belittled and gaslit and all that. And sometimes it's they thought they had this perfect marriage
Yes.
and they were completely blindsided, realize this person has this whole other life, another family, kids, another job, they're broke, they're in debt, all of these things. And they had no idea. And the betrayal trauma that exists from that is massive. And so then when they start to go back and piece together little things that they didn't pick up on, that had they been a little bit more aware of, maybe would have kind of, and you'll say like, yeah, I thought that was weird, but because part of the narcissist, the skill of what they do is to create the environment that they want so well. And the person then is stuck with, how did I not see this, and believes it to be their fault that they let it go on for this long. They could be so unbelievably intelligent and it wouldn't matter how smart they are. It really wouldn't matter. You have a trust in somebody and they construct this web of lives so carefully. There's no way you would have known until something slips up and you find out.
Exactly. And, Jaime, I would be curious to hear what you think about this, but as a clinician, I can almost tell in the first 10 minutes of meeting someone who's been betrayed if they're in a relationship with someone who is a narcissist, because of how destabilized they are,
Yes.
because of how much self responsibility they take for the healing process,
Yep.
for the marriage, for they're the driver of everything good. And they feel worthless, ashamed, discarded. They don't have any sense of self worth. All of these little things. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
what? I want to meet the other partner. I want to
Mm-hmm.
know more about what's really going on over here, because you can tell someone who's been in a relationship where they've just been so mind bent for so long by the way that they come at it and by the way that they react to the betrayal, and there's that outrage at the betrayal. Like, what?
Yeah.
We were this perfect
Yeah.
family, or, I never thought they would do this, or,
Yeah.
whatever. But then there's also a disproportionate amount of responsibility for the healing, and because they're not being met by their unfaithful spouse. They're like, hey, you caused this. If only you were better,
Yep.
I probably wouldn't have done this.
Yep. That's right.
And it is deeply wounding. But,
Mm-hmm.
as clinicians, we can tell very quickly
Mm-hmm.
based on the responses of both parties.
I mean, yeah, you nailed it. I mean, I can tell when somebody comes to me for help with how to get out of or identify if their partner is a narcissist and how to heal. Um, the way they talk about their quote role in the behavior that's going on, and the way they take accountability for things that objectively, and being trained in this, I can look at and say, wait, that has nothing to do with you. But they've been groomed for so long and sold this narrative for so long that this is their fault, that the way their partner acts is because of something that they did, right? That they hit you because you did this. They cheated because you did this. They stole your money because you did this. And because we can say when we're not in it, well, f that, I would never agree. when you're in this and you've been traumatized and brainwashed for years and you have no self-worth and your ability to accurately perceive reality has been so skewed and you have no one around you to run things by, to ground yourself because you've been so isolated, you have no choice but to believe that. And so, yeah, I agree with you. There's a very specific playbook for narcissistic abuse, and there's a very specific way that those who have been in these relationships talk about themselves.
Yes.
It's very clear, very quickly. I completely agree with that. I had a friend the other day. I was talking to her about something, and she had been through something just like this. And I had said something to her, and her response was, "Well, it's not that bad." I looked at her. In what planet is this not bad? And I reframed it for her. And this is just a friend that I'm talking to about something. And she looked at me, she goes, "Oh my God, wow." Like she was horrified that came out of her mouth, that it wasn't that bad. And she realized the reason why she said that is because there were so many things that she had to deal with and so many things that were done to her that in comparison, this wasn't that bad. But it is that bad. And so they become accustomed to and numb to all of these things, which is how the narcissist can do really bad things, but make it look not bad.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so it becomes very confusing as to what's appropriate and what's not in these types of relationships. It's okay, well, he only kissed her, he said. He didn't sleep with her, right? Or he only slept with her once, but that was it. Or, you know what I'm saying? Or he did, but he didn't, he just needed sex because, I didn't feel like it. So, I mean, I get that. I understand. There's always some sort of thing. And we think we'll never be in that situation. But let me tell you something. When your brain has been wired over years, that's exactly what happens.
It's exactly what happens. And you use the word confusion.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real key, is that sense of confusion and that misplaced sense of responsibility for the betrayal. You and I were talking before we got on here, and I want to go back to that important piece where it's very dangerous to say, what was your role
Yes.
in the affair? What was your role in the betrayal, in the infidelity, in the ending of this relationship, when you don't know if that person has been in a relationship with someone who's
Yes.
has an antagonistic personality style?
Yes.
Because the answer is your role was that you were there,
Mm-hmm.
and that you were so brain screwed that you didn't know which way was up anymore. And your healing is really your own at that point. It's not about taking responsibility for the marriage, because there was no way you could have taken responsibility. It was handed to you in hindsight. Well, you should have been better in all these other areas, because I was keeping score the whole time, but I never said anything to you. Why? Why didn't you ever say anything to me? So, I really, really have a strong visceral response to the whole, well, what was their role?
Yep.
Yes. In a normal relationship,
Yeah.
the inventory is always so important. But when we are dealing with someone who's been in a narcissistically abusive relationship, it's really about the self-healing
Yes.
that needs to come from building back or building a self that was never there all along, which is exactly why they ended up in a relationship with the narcissist, or they were chipped away at by the narcissist over time. Because oftentimes a narcissist is attracted to you because you are a wonderful,
exactly right.
successful, smart, magnetic person. And then they resent you for it.
That's right.
And they need to knock you down a peg. And that becomes the reason that you are destabilized by them. So we really need to be mindful that we never know. And, oftentimes, sometimes a spouse who's been in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic ends up stepping out of the relationship as a lifeline outside. So it can go both ways as well. Sometimes it's about a spouse who's been in a narcissistic relationship who is the one who had the affair.
Yes.
And they realize, wait, I should
almost as a survival strategy.
It's a survival. It's a life raft.
Yeah.
A life raft.
Yep.
And then they're like, wait a second, you speak to me in a respectful tone.
Yes.
You listen to me. You remembered this thing I said last week.
You give bare minimum.
Right. It's like crumbs is a feast.
Yes.
In a narcissistic relationship. And you get more and you're like, oh my God, is this how it's supposed to feel? So,
Right.
it's so nuanced. The person having the affair is not always the narcissist. Sometimes there's someone who's trying to escape a narcissist.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's interesting. The example I always give is one of my patients, former patients years ago, had gone on a date after having been with somebody. And the next time I met with her, she told me, she's like, I don't know. I think he's a narcissist. And why? What could possibly give you he held the car door for me. And I what? he he held the car door open for me as if like I'm not capable of doing that myself. Like I'm an independent, I can open my own car door. And I had to kind of take a step back and say, that plus a million other things, maybe, okay, but that behavior alone is actually extremely appropriate, kind, generous. It just is. They wanted to open the car door. They were being nice. That's a good thing. And so it was amazing to me that something like that, which you could think is just breadcrumbs, as you say, just bare minimum, little tiny pieces, are misconstrued and shows and reflects just how little they got in that relationship prior to it.
Yeah. Oh, and you get gun shy too. I mean, you get very afraid to end up in a relationship with someone who controls you in these similar ways. Anything that feels familiar or controlling is like, you're like a scared kitty who's backed into a corner and you're like, ugh. So, I always tell people proceed very slowly in relationships after you've been in a narcissistic relationship, because you need to trust yourself again. You need to learn the language of your nervous system again.
That's exactly right.
Stabilize, right?
You need to give yourself the experiences to rewire your brain, because essentially your body is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's protecting you from danger because you've been in that mode for, the whole duration of the relationship. So it makes sense you're responding like that, but you don't need to respond like that anymore. And so just like you said, the reason why to go and proceed with caution, first and foremost, is you have to regulate your nervous system. That's the first thing. Then comes the other stuff, but that's the biggest, because if you don't have that, you can't then tackle how to emotionally heal, because you're basing it off of a completely unregulated, dysregulated, destabilized nervous system.
And your lens for what a relationship should look and feel like is obviously not trustworthy.
Yes.
Because you've been in an abusive relationship for so long. And we know that the psychological abuse is so damaging because it destabilizes a person's sense of self and self-trust. And they become more reliant on their psychological abuser because they look to that person to be their sense of reality in the world, because they've learned that they can't trust themselves, because they're told that it's always their fault, or it's always not what they think, or it's always something different, or you're wrong, or you're too sensitive, or you're too this. And so you begin to actually increase your reliance on your spouse who is manipulating you. And you need time to heal those things. One of the things that when I'm working with someone who's been in a marriage or is in a marriage with someone who's a narcissist, and they're doing what you had told me your friend was doing, which is like, well, maybe it's not that bad, or, well, he said this. I always ask them to stop and use themselves as the measure. Would you say that to another person? And they're like, no, I wouldn't. And they know, know it, because they feel it in their body that they're trying to accept the unacceptable.
That's right.
They're trying to justify the unjustifiable to keep their life intact as well.
That's right.
But when you get quiet and you distill it down inside of yourself, would you ever do that and tell somebody it was their fault? Would you ever speak like that to someone and then expect them to sleep with you? Would you? No, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
So it's a very different set of behaviors that when you use yourself as the measure, you begin to say, ugh, yeah, no.
Right. Because then you have to look at yourself and you realize there's a discrepancy, and then you have to resolve it. And that's the hard work.
Yeah, it is the hard work. And back to your point of like, leaving is hard. Staying is hard.
Yeah.
It's all hard. So it's like, choose
hard.
your hard, and not everyone's hard is going to be the same kind of hard. Yeah. Sometimes people have to stay to protect their children, or, make sure that there's one person who's psychologically healthy in the home, but they're doing their own work to stabilize outside of that narcissistic relationship so that there is a self that they can, have, even if their spouse is still, being who they
That's
are.
right. That's right.
So there's a lot of layers to that, nobody wears a t-shirt saying all of these things that they're dealing with. They just don't. We just see the outside and we make judgments and assumptions.
Which is why I love your work, because you never pass judgment. It doesn't matter how difficult what you're talking about is, you never pass judgment. It's one of the, that's one of the things that I just really admire about your work, because it's a very difficult topic with a lot of hurt feelings and strong views. And so you do a phenomenal job balancing that. You have a book coming out. Tell everybody about your book.
It's called Beyond Infidelity, Turning the End of Your Relationship into the Beginning of Your Life. And it's available for pre-order now. It will be out January 6th, which feels like a long way away, but it will not be so far, very soon. So yeah, it's out through Penguin Random House, and you can just Google it if you want to pre-order it.
Great. And I'll include in the show notes, the link so people can access the book. Where can people find you on social media and your website?
LaurenLaRusso.com is my website, and Instagram is at Lauren LaRusso. And I would love to see everyone there. It's a nuanced conversation, and I'm just really grateful to be having it.
Thank you so much. I adore these conversations. I think you're brilliant. And like I said, do such a good job of navigating a really difficult topic. So thank you for being on here. I really appreciate it. And we'll definitely have you back soon.
Thank you so much.
Everyone have a good day. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. I hope you found it useful, but most importantly, I hope you found it validating. Want to work one-on-one with me? Visit my website at drjamiezuckerman.com to book a personalized coaching session, and be sure to check out my on-demand workshops on topics like co-parenting with a narcissist, life after leaving, anxiety management strategies, and more. Again, that's drjamiezuckerman.com. You'll also find links to my interactive workbooks, merchandise, resources, and newsletter sign-up. Next Up Narcissism is as much your podcast as it is mine. I want to hear your feedback and what you want to hear. So make sure to leave a podcast review wherever you listen, or send an email to nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Again, that's nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to tune in next week to see what's up next on Next Up Narcissism.